In the winter of 1862, 38 men climbed a single massive scaffold in front of 4,000 watching eyes. They held each other's hands. They sang. And then, in one synchronized drop, they were gone. It was the largest mass execution in United States history, and almost no one talks about it. Welcome to Frontier Uncensored. I'm your host, Dustin, and today we're diving into one of the most haunting and misunderstood chapters of American history. The Dakota War of 1862 and the Mankato executions that ended it. If you want more stories like this, ones that cut through the myths of the Wild West and get to the raw truth, hit that subscribe button right now and ring the notification bell. Let's get into it. To understand what happened in Mankato, you have to go back further, way back, to a time before the conflict, before the war, before the executions. You have to understand the world the Dakota Sioux were living in and what was slowly being taken from them. The Dakota Sioux were not a small or insignificant people. They had lived across the Minnesota Territory for generations, and their culture was rich, layered, and deeply tied to the land. Men wore clothing made from deer hide and buffalo skin, practical and durable gear built for the harsh Minnesota winters and the demands of the hunt. Feathered headdresses carried spiritual meaning, connecting the wearer to the natural world and the spirits that the Dakota believed inhabited everything around them, every animal, every plant, every river bend. The buffalo was at the center of that spiritual world. It represented life itself, food, warmth, trade, and a sacred bond between the Dakota people and the earth they called home. Then the settlers came. Through the 1840s and 1850s, waves of European-descended settlers pushed westward into Minnesota, drawn by the promise of cheap land and new beginnings. For the Dakota, this was not expansion. It was encirclement. In 1851, the United States government pushed through two major agreements with the Dakota: the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux and the Treaty of Mendota. On paper, these treaties offered the Dakota money, food, and ongoing support in exchange for giving up enormous stretches of their ancestral land in the Minnesota Territory. What remained for the Dakota was a narrow reservation just 20 miles wide, running along roughly 150 miles of the upper Minnesota River. That was it. Generations of homeland compressed into a strip. And even that came with broken promises. The government payments arrived late, or not at all. Traders who operated near the reservation ran up debts in the Dakota's names, real or invented, and collected their share before any money reached the actual families. The wild game that the Dakota had long relied on was disappearing fast. Settlers were farming and cutting timber across the land surrounding the reservation, breaking the natural cycles the Dakota depended on for hunting, fishing, and gathering wild rice. Buffalo, elk, deer, bear. The populations of all of them were shrinking in southern and western Minnesota. Less game meant less meat. Less meat meant hunger. And hunger in a community already hemmed in on all sides is a pressure that builds and builds. In 1858, when Minnesota officially became a state, Dakota leaders, including Little Crow, traveled all the way to Washington hoping to renegotiate the terms of their treaties and restore some of what they had lost. They came back with less than they had before. The northern portion of their reservation, along the Minnesota River, was stripped away as part of the statehood process. That land was quickly divided up and handed to settlers who cleared it almost immediately. The forests and grasslands that remained in Dakota Territory continued to shrink. By the summer of 1862, the situation had reached a breaking point. Crop failures that year meant the Dakota could not supplement their diet through farming. The treaty payments, which were supposed to arrive in the spring, were delayed. Families were hungry. Children were hungry. And the promises that had been made to the Dakota for over a decade had been broken so many times that few believed any new assurances from Washington. On January 1st, 1862, a man named George E.H. Day, a special commissioner on Dakota affairs and an attorney from St. Anthony, Minnesota, wrote a significant letter to President Abraham Lincoln. Day had been assigned to investigate the grievances of the Sioux, and his letter laid out clearly what was happening on the reservation. It was a formal acknowledgement from inside the U.S. government itself that the Dakota were being failed. However, letters and investigations moved slowly, and hunger did not wait. By early August of 1862, the desperation had become impossible to ignore. On August 4th, leaders from the northern Dakota bands, the Sisseton and Wahpeton, gathered at the Upper Sioux Agency to negotiate for food. That meeting went well enough, but 11 days later, on August 15th, two other Dakota bands, the Imdawakanton and the Wapakute, arrived at the Lower Sioux Agency seeking the same thing: supplies, food for their families. Indian Agent Thomas Galbraith, who also served as a Minnesota state senator, refused to release food without payment. A formal meeting was held where Dakota representatives sat across from U.S. government officials and local traders. The Dakota asked a trader named Andrew Jackson Myrick for food on credit. Myrick's response has been quoted in history books ever since. He said, "So far as I am concerned, if they are hungry, let them eat grass." The exact context of those words is still debated by historians. Some versions suggest he may have been referring to Dakota women already searching the fort stables for leftover oats to feed their children. But whatever the precise meaning, the effect was devastating. Little Crow later wrote that Myrick's response was one of the key moments that pushed his people toward war. Then, on August 16th, the long-delayed treaty payments finally arrived in St. Paul. They were forwarded to Fort Ridgely the very next day, but it was already too late. On August 17th, 4 young Dakota warriors, desperate and furious after years of watching their families suffer, encountered a group of white settlers while looking for food. The confrontation turned deadly. 5 settlers were killed. Word spread fast, and within hours the leaders of the Dakota community faced a decision that would define everything that followed. Late into the night of August 17th, Dakota leaders debated in council. Some urged restraint. Little Crow himself initially hesitated, telling his warriors that fighting the Americans was ultimately a losing proposition. He knew the numbers. He knew the resources the U.S. government could bring to bear. But the anger in his community was overwhelming, and by morning the decision had been made. On August 18th, 1862, Little Crow led a coordinated assault on the Lower Sioux Agency, also known as the Redwood Agency. It was swift and organized. Among the casualties that morning was Andrew Myrick, the trader whose callous words just weeks earlier had become a rallying point of rage. Myrick tried to escape through an attic window and was shot down as he fled toward the cornfields. When his body was discovered later, grass had been stuffed into his mouth. A grim and deliberate message. After the initial assault, Dakota war parties fanned out across the Minnesota River Valley, attacking farms and settlements throughout the region. Milford, Leavenworth, Sacred Heart, all of them were hit hard. The 5th Minnesota Volunteer Infantry sent soldiers from Fort Ridgely to respond, but they were stopped at the Battle of Redwood Ferry. 24 soldiers died in that engagement, including their commanding officer, Captain John Marsh. Have you ever heard of this conflict before today? Most people haven't. Drop a comment and let us know how much of this history you knew going in. Amid the violence, something more complicated was also happening. Some Dakota individuals warned personal friends at the agency, giving them time to escape. One man, a trading post clerk named George Spencer, was spared entirely through the direct intervention of a Dakota leader known as Little Crow's head soldier. Captives were taken, mostly women and children, and their treatment varied widely. Some were protected by Dakota families who adopted them into their households. Others experienced hardship and harm. The history here is contested and painful, and historians have been careful to document both the protection that some captives received and the abuses that others suffered. Dakota leaders themselves were divided on what to do with the captives. Chief Big Eagle believed they should be returned to the fort. Little Crow insisted on keeping them, arguing that they were valuable as hostages and that the Dakota could ensure their safety better than a chaotic battlefield could. As the war dragged on, the responsibility for feeding and caring for the prisoners was shared among multiple families in Little Crow's camp. The Dakota continued their offensive through late August. They attacked the town of New Ulm on August 19th and again with greater force on August 23rd. Fort Ridgely was targeted on August 20th and 22nd. The Dakota could not capture the fort, but they hampered American forces significantly, ambushing a relief column heading toward New Ulm on August 21st. Across south-central Minnesota and into the eastern Dakota Territory, raids on farms and small settlements continued. Minnesota Governor Alexander Ramsey responded by calling on former Governor Henry Hastings Sibley to lead a military expedition. Sibley was an unusual choice. He had no real military experience, but he had spent nearly 3 decades trading with the Dakota in the Minnesota River Valley, and he knew the leaders personally. He was commissioned as a colonel of volunteers and began assembling his force. On August 26th, Sibley marched out of St. Peter with 1,400 men, including the 6th Minnesota Volunteer Infantry Regiment and 300 irregular troops. By August 27th, the siege of Fort Ridgely was broken. Sibley's forces arrived and established camp outside the fort, and nearly 250 refugees who had been trapped inside for over a week were transported to St. Paul. Back in Washington, the scale of the conflict was becoming clear. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton established the Department of the Northwest on September 6, 1862, and appointed General John Pope to command it. Pope arrived in Minnesota on September 16th with orders to restore order by force. Reinforcements trickled in slowly, including the 25th Wisconsin Volunteer Infantry Regiment, which arrived on September 22nd. The decisive confrontation came on September 23, 1862, at a place called Wood Lake. On the night of September 22nd, Little Crow, Chief Big Eagle, and other Dakota leaders moved their warriors into position in the tall grass alongside the road leading toward the Upper Sioux Agency. Their plan was to ambush Sibley's column as it marched north at dawn. It was a solid tactical idea, but it fell apart in an unexpected way. Early that morning, around 7 in the morning, a group of soldiers from the 3rd Minnesota Infantry set out on their own in 4 or 5 wagons, without orders, to dig potatoes at the Upper Sioux Agency about half a mile from camp. As they crossed a bridge and rolled up onto the open prairie, 25 to 30 Dakota warriors who had been waiting in the grass sprang up and opened fire. The ambush, meant for an entire marching column, was triggered by a handful of men going to get potatoes. The Battle of Wood Lake erupted. Major Abraham Welch led 200 men in a skirmish formation before pulling back on Sibley's orders. Lieutenant Colonel William Rainey Marshall took 5 companies of the 7th Minnesota Infantry and an artillery piece around to the north side of camp, advanced through dugouts, and charged successfully, driving the Dakota back from a key ravine. On the south side of the lake, Major Robert McLaren led a company around to defend a ridge overlooking another ravine, defeating a Dakota flanking attempt. After roughly 2 hours of hard fighting, Little Crow and his warriors retreated. Chief Mankato, one of the most capable Dakota military leaders, was killed during the battle by an artillery round. Big Eagle later noted that hundreds of Dakota fighters never even got to fire a shot because they were positioned too far from the actual fighting to engage. Sibley's forces suffered 7 killed and 34 seriously wounded. The exact Dakota casualties were never fully recorded. The Dakota War of 1862, which had lasted just 37 days, was effectively over. On September 26th, at a place called Camp Release, the Dakota Peace Faction handed over 269 former prisoners to Colonel Sibley. Among them were 162 mixed-blood Dakota and 107 white captives, mostly women and children. As Little Crow and a portion of his followers fled north toward the plains, other warriors who had participated in the war quietly filtered into the friendly Dakota camp at Camp Release, drawn by the approach of winter and Sibley's stated promise that only those directly responsible for settler deaths would face punishment. What followed was one of the most legally questionable episodes in American judicial history. Between September and November of 1862, military tribunals were held to try Dakota men for their roles in the war. 498 men were tried. 303 were found guilty and sentenced to death. The trials were extraordinarily brief, some lasting just minutes, with little to no formal representation for the defendants. By modern legal standards, the proceedings would be considered fundamentally flawed. But in the hysteria of the moment, with settler communities demanding retribution, the sentences were handed down rapidly. The final decision rested with President Abraham Lincoln. Facing enormous political pressure from Minnesota's congressional delegation and the state's governor, Lincoln nonetheless took the time to personally review the trial transcripts. He narrowed the list of executions down to 39 men, those for whom there was evidence of involvement in direct attacks on civilians rather than battlefield combat. One additional sentence was suspended just before the scheduled date. On the morning of December 26, 1862, 38 Dakota men were led to a specially constructed scaffold in Mankato, Minnesota. An estimated 4,000 people lined the streets to watch. By contemporary accounts, the men ascended the platform calmly. They held hands. They sang a Dakota song together. And then, simultaneously, the platform dropped. It remains the largest mass execution in United States history. The stories of the survivors are just as stark. Of the 303 men originally sentenced to death, those whose sentences were commuted were transported to Davenport, Iowa, where they were held in military prison for 3 years before eventually being sent into exile. The 1,758 Dakota men, women, and children, including families of both hostile and friendly Dakota, who had been gathered near Fort Snelling, were loaded onto steamboats and relocated to a reservation at Crow Creek in South Dakota. The conditions at Crow Creek were brutal. Hundreds died in the first year. The majority of Dakota people today live in exile from their original homeland, primarily in Nebraska and South Dakota. Many of their ancestors fled to Canada in the years after 1862 to escape the consequences of the war and its aftermath. The land along the Minnesota River, where the Dakota had lived for generations and where so much blood was spilled in 1862, is today dotted with farms, small towns, and historical markers that only hint at the depth of what happened there. The story of the Dakota War and the Mankato executions is not a simple one. It is a story of broken promises and desperation, of violence and its consequences, of political decisions made under pressure, and of a people who were cornered and chose to fight, even knowing the odds were overwhelming. It is a story that deserves to be told fully and honestly, without flinching from the complexity on every side. If this episode opened your eyes to a chapter of frontier history you had never heard before, we want to know. Leave a comment below. Tell us what surprised you the most. Was it the scale of the executions? The legal proceedings? The story of the treaties? Let us know, because your comments help shape the stories we tell next. And before you go, a final detail that stays with you. Andrew Myrick, the trader who told a starving people to eat grass, was found dead on August 18th with grass stuffed in his mouth. History has a way of answering cruelty in its own language. The 38 men who died in Mankato that December morning left behind descendants who are still here, still speaking, still remembering. Their story didn't end on that scaffold. It continues. This has been Frontier Uncensored. I'm Dustin. If you found today's story powerful, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you haven't already, and we'll see you in the next episode.